Okay, I'm going to try to keep things pretty brief, and then hand things over to Domeick to, walk you through the tutorial a little bit more, go in detail, and start answering some questions. But I'll just tell you about a little bit of the work that we've done. That's kind of you'll see some of it in the tutorial itself. Okay, so I wanted to start by I know probably a lot of people in here are extracellular electrophysiologists, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what the data you'll be working with are, like where they come from. So you'll be working with recordings from motor cortex, so primary motor cortex M1 and dorsal premotor PMD. So these are two electrode arrays. One of these electrode arrays, each one is a Utah array. So they're 100 electrodes. It's like a little bed of nails. Each one of these is 1 millimeter long. And we just record action potentials with extracellular ephys. So this is an example of one of these recordings from premotor cortex while a monkey was moving its arm around. Is this all like, everybody knows this or? No? Okay, yeah. So everything you're seeing here, like this is the voltage on one electrode. The little blips you're seeing, these are action potentials, so you can see like some of them are picking them up pretty well. Sometimes people will like try to identify individual neurons with these recordings. That's like spike sorting. Other people will just like look at the voltages and say like, okay, anytime something crosses a certain level, let's call that a spike. Just be really kind of loose with it, and which is often very effective for some things. But anyway, the data you're working with are spike sorted, so somebody took the time after the recording offline to go very carefully and say like, this waveform is from one neuron, this other waveform is from another neuron, etc. Does that all make sense to people? Okay. And then the behavior that these data are from, again, this is from motor cortex. This is data collected by Mark Churchland and Matt Kaufman when they were in Krishna Shenoy's lab a few years ago. And so it's about 200 neurons in motor cortex. And the monkey is doing this reaching behavior where it's trying to make different reaches to move a cursor on a screen. And it gets a reward after every time it kind of gets a target. And specifically, just to give you a sense of the structure of the data, there's this is a delayed reaching task, meaning so the monkey sees the screen, and the target comes up, and this is particularly what I think this is probably Mark's innovation, this maze task. So a lot of times you'll see like this type of data is like monkeys just reaching like 8 targets, straight reaches over and over again. But they made this kind of virtual maze and trained the monkey, like if you run into the barriers here, you're not going to get your reward. So they could put up these different virtual maze configurations and get the monkeys to make like more complicated reaching movements, like curved movements or straight movements, counterclockwise, clockwise, that sort of thing. So the way this task is structured, so this is maybe one condition, like the target's going to be there. You can see there's a barrier, so you start always starting in the center. There's a barrier, so you have to go around it, right? So this is going to be a curved reach. But the monkey sees the target first and then gets a separate explicit go cue. Okay, so it kind of separates out the process of motor preparation. You see the target, you can plan your reach. From motor execution, which you get the go cue and you actually move. So prepare, you see the target, get a go cue, the monkey actually moves. So that's I just want to make sure you guys kind of understand the structure of the data you'll be working with in this delayed reaching task. Okay, and then to give you a sense of what the data look like, so I was showing you these recordings, extracellular electrophysiology. Oh, please, yeah.
Why was it called delayed?
Delayed, so like a lot of times these types of tasks, like as soon as the target pops up, the monkey will immediately reach, right? So there's no delay period there. And so because the monkey's been trained, the target will pop up, but don't reach. If you reach too early, you're not going to get your juice, right? So the monkey learns, okay, the target's up, but I can't reach until I get a separate cue. And so that means, like, if you study, the brain activity, you can see separate kind of processes, one while the monkey's preparing, and then kind of a separate set of neural dynamics as the monkey begins executing the reach. Okay, and the cool thing about this, because this is this virtual maze, they could have all these different conditions. There are 108 total conditions in the maze data set. Actually, I guess the one, I don't remember how many conditions are in this one. Okay, so yeah, they only pick some subset of the conditions, but it's more than you typically get with motor cortical data, for sure. Okay, and then, so we were talking about action potentials. So you have this like continuous voltage, and then you're just looking for when did the neuron fire a spike. That's effectively like a binary signal, right? It's like 0, 0, 0. There's a spike 1, then 0, 0, 0 again. So the data, if you visualized it, like each row here would be a neuron, and it would, these little tick marks are like the spike times of an individual neuron. Okay, and so there are about 200 neurons. There are spike times, and then there are all these different conditions, right? Like, maybe a curved reach up, maybe a curved reach down, maybe a straight reach. Like, so all these different conditions, and then each of those conditions, they made the monkey reach multiple times. So like in random order, so it might be condition 1, then condition 2, or whatever. But the point is you see the same behavior multiple times, okay? So that would, each one of those is a trial. One of the kind of traditional ways of dealing with this data is just like take all the repeats of the same condition and average across trials. So trial averaging, and then and maybe smooth the response a little bit. So then you go from this kind of like discrete binary data to this like smooth, what we'd call a firing rate. For each neuron, you now have a firing rate versus time. And that's like a pretty traditional way of dealing with this data. The methods that we develop are to try to kind of get past that. So why would you do this? It's because like the spiking activity itself, the action potentials, like they're super variable from trial to trial. So it seems like there's a lot of variability there that's kind of noise. It doesn't seem to relate to the behavior at all. It's really like not stereotyped. And then, so averaging across trials is one way of kind of getting rid of that noise to try to get to kind of the signal underlying this activity. But that is, of course, making an assumption that every time the monkey made the reach, it was doing the exact same thing, because you're averaging any variability out, right? So it's not an ideal thing to do, but when you kind of have noisy data, that's maybe one of your options. But in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of, of course, our ability to record neural population activity. Hopefully everybody knows is changing like pretty dramatically. So this is a study from Ian Stevenson and Conrad Carding, where they looked at just like surveyed the literature and say like how many neurons did people report recording in their paper, like and seeing as that number grows over time. And hopefully what you see here is like that y-axis is a log scale. So that linear growth on a log scale means we're exponentially increasing our recording capacity over time. So our access to like neural population data is just like going in leaps and bounds. This is probably outdated by this point, but we're already with multi-neuropixel recordings and stuff, we're getting to like thousands of neurons simultaneously recorded. So we have an opportunity now to like really take different approaches to our data, right? Like instead of, if you need to denoise your data, you don't necessarily have to average across a bunch of trials and lose all that variability, but maybe we can use machine learning to try to approach some of these population recordings. Oh, so yeah, recording capacity doubles. Here, about every 6 years, I think in the NeuroPixels era, we're starting to even surpass that a little bit. So the key opportunity here is to combine kind of these large-scale recording techniques with machine learning methods and do single trial analyses now instead of averaging across trials. So we can study processes that were previously challenging, like more complicated behaviors, maybe model systems where it's hard to train the animal to make the same reach a bunch of times. Maybe cases where single trial variability is itself important, like a cognitive process where the cognitive process changes from trial to trial, but you don't see anything externally. There's no like external report of that. Or think something that some of us care a lot about, or the brain-machine interfaces, assistive devices to help people who are paralyzed. If the person wants to, let's say, control a robotic arm, you don't want them to have to try to make the same reach 20 times before you move the arm. You want things to just work like on single trials in real time, et cetera. So there's a lot of opportunity for machine learning in this space. So the data you'll be working with today we released as part of a large project called the Neural Latence Benchmark. And the idea here is that like in our little corner of neuroscience, this kind of population recording, machine learning space, people are developing new models all the time, and you hear about all these like acronyms, and everybody's reporting that like, oh, my model is better than that other one, but like you don't actually know like which model is kind of most appropriate, which model is good for my data, which model performs better. And the machine learning community kind of solved this problem a long time ago by releasing kind of benchmarks. So reference data sets where like here's the data set everybody's going to compare their model on. Here are the metrics we use to evaluate performance, those sorts of things. And that's in image processing that drove a lot of like the early kind of developments in like convolutional networks and things like that. In language modeling that we've been talking about today, same thing where we've seen kind of progress is really documented carefully by these benchmarks. So our goal was to try to do something very similar for neural population activity. And so that's some of the data you'll be working with today. And it's been kind of cool. We've had a lot of people kind of, we released this in September of 21, and we've had a lot of people develop models, test them out on the benchmark. You'll be able to do that today, I think, like develop a model and try it on benchmark data and see kind of where you score relative to these other models. This plot kind of shows, so auto LFADs, that's some work we developed. We kind of seeded the benchmark with that, so we just reported like what the performance was with our own models. NDT is a model I'll talk to you about in a little bit. That's actually using the transformer architecture that we talked about today, just using the encoder piece. So that's what you're basically developing in this tutorial is NDT, which is that first gray dot up there. And I'll tell you about that model. So a bunch of people kind of submitted things. The green triangles here are people who did an ensembling approach. Are folks familiar with ensembling in machine learning at all? It's like where you train, let's see, instead of training one model, you train like a whole bunch of models, and then you take your top, let's say 10, and average their output. And so it's a way of kind of reducing the variability in your output. Anyway, so that's a cool approach. It's a great way to like win Kaggle competitions. It's not necessarily the easiest way to kind of interpret these models. So anyway, I'll just remove those for a second. But a lot of these models are actually transformer based. So using the same concepts that you guys are working on. So STNDT, they took our NDT approach and made it a spatiotemporal neural data transformer. Neural Roberta, you guys saw I pulled up that Hugging Face website earlier. There's some like open source code on there. So they grabbed one of like the latest transformer models from there called Roberta and threw it at this neural data. So kind of cool that they could just kind of take something that way. So anyway, our goal here has been to just kind of be able to document progress in this space. S5 from Scott's lab is now kind of topping the leaderboard pretty hard. When we were talking earlier about there's some models that are somehow outperforming transformers on long sequences. So S5 is one of those. It's this thing called state space modeling. I was shocked that they were able to use a state space modeling approach to win the leaderboard. So anyway, lots of cool stuff going on. Okay, so but you guys are going to develop transformer-based models. The last thing I'll just say is So the NDT paper that you guys, the model that you'll be developing is kind of based around neural data transformers. And so the goal here is, it's exactly the same motivation that we were talking about earlier today. Like our previous approaches for modeling this type of data was using recurrent neural networks, an approach I co-developed called LFADs. And recurrent neural networks are really cool. But we wanted to see if we could use transformers in this space because of all the progress in natural language processing. So basically, the input to the model is the spiking activity. I showed you guys spiking activity, which is the action potential times. And then the goal of the model is to denoise that activity by outputting the firing rates for every individual neuron. So key point being, just like when we were going over the transformer architecture today, it was a bunch of words. Those were like the original input, and then the transformer encoder output kind of the same dimensionality, but just like with contextual information. We're doing kind of a very similar thing here where the input is spiking activity and the output is the same dimensionality, but it's kind of lost a lot of that variability or the noise that we see on individual trials. So we're trying to denoise that. And I think I can mostly turn it over to, you guys know self-attention now. You're experts at attention, I think. But you can see taking embeddings, turning them into queries, keys, and values, combining those with dot products, and then creating your output. That's exactly what we're doing in this NDT architecture. And just the last thing I wanted to show was just the speed up. So we were talking about, like, is it faster to run transformers? So these sequences that you're working with are, how long are these sequences? Like 400? No. 140, okay. So actually not that long. We benchmarked performance of just like how much time does it take to run the model for NDT versus our previous model, LFADS, and it's like a factor of 6 or 7, even on this, what is a fairly short sequence for these types of applications, like 100 something. So you can just tell, anyway, same types of issues we were talking about. These models have a huge advantage in terms of speed. All right, so Domeick will take over and walk you guys through the tutorial.
So Chethan's introduction was pretty much this first section, 2.1. So we're going to assume that you know all that. And now we're going to, I know some folks didn't get to finish the section 2.2, so I'll just go over that. Basically, this first part on word embeddings is trying to form a concrete example about how these different embeddings actually relate to each other in embedding space. You can see that words we intuitively would think would be grouped are grouped via, yeah.
Is this embedding space always determined by us?
It's determined by how you create the embedding. So if you're using like word2vec, then this embedding space would be determined by that. And in this example, we are creating the embedding, so it's up to us what this space looks like. Because we defined our own axes, so. And then we just kind of go into why the dot product is a good similarity metric for these different embeddings. Just kind of doesn't really go into what cosine similarity is, which is like a much simpler version, but transformers use dot product, which takes into account the magnitude of these vectors.
Sorry,
Yeah.
If you don't normalize those values within -1 to 1, does it still work?
That was just an example for these embeddings. They're not normalized from 1 to 1, really. Like, it's not a requirement. Was that your question?
Yeah, just wondering whether it needs to be between -1.
No, definitely not. And then we just go into adding another word, similar. And then for the queries, keys, and values, this section is just sort of like another concrete example of how the attention interaction actually would, it's very hard to think about what this interaction is actually doing when it's trying to like route information. So it's really nice to think about it as just trying to pull information from like a database or like a filing cabinet and then forming a new file. And then multi-head attention is just the same process repeated in parallel so that it's not required that you use multi-head attention. It could be the same thing if you just kept stacking the transformer, except you're going to have a slowdown. So it's pretty much just a trick to speed up computation.
Isn't that multi-headed attention, is that just the parallelism and stacking, is that just happening for each word?
Yes. So there's going to be like a certain number of heads, and each head will look at all the words. Yeah.
distribution over potentially different votes.
Yeah, so the heads are not actually communicating with each other. It's just like this entire process is separate for each head.
So kind of an ensemble type.
Yeah.
idea.
And I don't think, how many folks have actually completed 2.3? All right, I think this will be a good, just finish this section up and then I'm gonna walk around and see if folks have any questions. There's just one coding exercise at the end, so this is just a very simple. If you remember a lot from the lecture, feel free to just skim over it.